Hello, and welcome to this week's recording of the overview of the Acts of the Apostles. We are well into chapter 27 now. We finished about 20 verses, and kind of a cliffhanger. Last week I left you with Paul on board ship as a prisoner with many other prisoners and other folks caught in a storm. And it's a very bad storm. The ship's captain, the ship's crew are throwing things over the side to try to lighten the load and keep themselves from going down. They are at a point where they're abandoning hope, and they're pretty well convinced that the ship is going to sink. And I think I left you with some questions about when in your own life you may have been at a point where you were ready to abandon all hope. And have there been times in your life when you were not sure you were going to get out alive? I think there have been some times in my life when I look back and went, man, I am blessed to have been able to survive that. Well, that's where Paul is in this, and all of the folks that are on the ship with him. And Christ followers are called to reach out to others who are experiencing that kind of hopelessness with hope, the hope we find in Jesus Christ, even though we may not have the best of relationships with those people. Paul was a prisoner on this ship, and yet we'll find out in the rest of this chapter and the next that he did what a good Christ follower would do in trying to reach out to everybody else on the ship with a sense of hope in a hopeless situation. So starting at verse 21 and going through 26 then, if you haven't already read that, please go back and review it and read it, and then continue watching the video. The men had gone a long time without food. Is it anxiety? Maybe, you're pretty rough seas. I don't usually get seasick myself. My wife gets it extremely easily. Food is not high on her priority list when that happens. Maybe the foodstuffs became inedible because of the sea waves, water washing over the deck and spoiling the food with the sea salt. In this case, not a good kind of sea salt. The storm may have ruined the food. Maybe it made cooking impossible. Where do you cook when you're in the midst of a storm? So Paul stands up in their midst, not in front of them. It's not like, hear ye, pay attention to me. He's right in the middle of all of them and says, in essence, cheer up. The outcome will be positive. And everybody's like, yeah, right. So he reviews the counsel he gave them at Fairhaven. And it's not like he really wanted to say, hey, I told you so. But partly to establish why he should be believed now, to answer that unspoken question of why should we listen to you. So he frames what they should have done using his favorite verb for divine necessity. Listen to God. Paul then urges them, keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. The ship will be destroyed, but not one of the humans aboard the ship will be lost. So he immediately proceeds to give his source of information, his allegiance, his piety, all of his devotion to the one true God. That God has sent an angel this very night, or in the NIV it says last night. He approached me, or stood beside me in the NIV, and gave this message of encouragement, which reframes a divine promise and acknowledges a gracious gift. Excuse me. So just like when he was in Corinth, The angel urged Paul to stop being afraid. I would be afraid if I was caught in that kind of a storm that was literally threatening to break apart the ship. So he reiterated his divine necessity, God's will, of standing before trial in Caesar's court. So this is a divine necessity. Paul knows he's supposed to go stand trial before Caesar and proclaim the gospel. So this will happen. So he announced this good news. God has graciously given you the lives of all of you who sail with you. This is a certainty, Paul says. Not one of you will be lost. So Luke does not, the author here, does not explicitly say that this is an answer to Paul's intercession. All we can be sure about is that God is determined that Paul not die at sea, and has further decided to preserve those who are on the ship with Paul. Could God rescue Paul without rescuing everyone else? Certainly. But Paul says God has promised not one of you will perish, although the ship will be lost. So Paul's application of the angel's message to the other travelers is a call to keep up their courage. Be encouraged. And having an encourager in our lives is so important. How many times you just feel down? You just kind of start to feel like, is this all worth it? Well, if you have someone who is an encourager, it lifts you up. Well, it probably lifts up the encourager too. Paul becomes the encourager in this case. He also states they will run aground on some island. Paul bases this message on his own faith that God's deed will match the prophetic word. And the prophetic word is that not one of them will perish in the shipwreck, and they will all be run aground on some island. Paul models for us a stance of one who is convinced that God's gracious purposes cannot be frustrated, even when outward circumstances call that belief into action. It's not that Paul is simply a practical man in a critical emergency. It's not like he's just keeping his head when all around him are losing theirs. Look back at verse 24. The angel who appears to Paul reminds him to not be afraid. So certainly he was afraid. It's precisely because Paul is being impractical in this situation, and he is a holy man, a Christian apostle who receives messages from angels, that he can be the voice of encouragement within the fury of the storm. He's part of what's going on. He's scared, and he is the voice of encouragement. So Paul's strength here comes from beyond the storm. He believes God, that God can accomplish what God has promised. Such faith is the foundation for a life of encouragement, despite our own personal fears sometimes. So, beginning at verse 27, going through 44, backstory here. Athlete and missionary by the name of Eric Liddell, also known as the Flying Scotsman, some of you may have heard of him. He won the 400-meter race in the 1924 Paris Olympics. And it is interesting that we just had the Paris Olympics in 2024. And he did so in a world record-setting time. His real heroics occurred 20 years later in Weinstein concentration camp in China. This missionary's faith and energy encouraged many of the 1,800 trapped in the camp's nasty conditions. Uncle Eric, as he was known to children separated from their parents, organized activities for people, served as a teacher, served as a guardian for the youth. and he fulfilled the role of pastor until a brain tumor claimed his life in February 1945. Lindell's message of encouragement was this: circumstances may appear to wreck our lives and God's plan, but God is not helpless in the ruins. Many centuries and many miles away on a dark, storm-tossed Mediterranean sea, Paul, too, is determined to make a difference to those around him. His example helps us understand what it is to proclaim by one's life and by one's faith the salvation blessings found in Christ alone. So 2 weeks have passed since the ship's initial departure in the storm. 2 weeks they've been in this storm. If the ship had been driven across the Adriatic Sea at a rate of 1 1/2 knots, that would mean it covered 482 nautical miles. On a course of a very shallow curve, the ship would find itself at Malta, some 474 nautical miles from Crete. So about midnight, we're told, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. Doesn't tell us how they sensed it, but they may have been taking soundings along the way. The sailors test their sense that land is near by casting a lead line overboard to take depth soundings. Their unit of measurement is a fathom, the distance between fingertips when the arms are extended out fully, so approximately 6 feet. Probably no more than 30 minutes later, a sounding finds that the seafloor is 30 feet closer. So the sailors take immediate action to halt the ship's drift toward a coast that they cannot make out in the dark. They hurl 4 anchors from the ship's stern, probably a casting and cable rope with 2 anchors attached from each side of the stern. This would halt the ship's progress and position it so that its bow is facing the shore to prevent the waves from making damaging broadside blows on the ship. The vessel is now poised for its approach at daybreak. The sailors have done all that they know to do. Now all that is left is to keep on wishing for daylight, or the NIV says they prayed for daylight. Though God is sovereign, human beings still have some responsibility. We still need to be participants in whatever God is doing. So these sailors met their responsibilities. We must meet our responsibilities, especially facing adverse circumstances that can tempt us to despair, can tempt us to be inactive, to kind of shut down and do nothing. That's not what God calls us to do, and that's not what the voice of encouragement would call us to do. Keep fighting the good fight, Paul would say. So important is the crew to the survival of all that when some seek escape under the pretext of using a dinghy to position anchors from the bow, Paul draws this to the attention of the centurion and his men. He says, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. Luke may be playing on his topic of salvation here, speaking of a physical rescue, but intending to point beyond it to salvation blessings. So the word of promise is, God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. Verse 24. If the sailors jump ship, this promise cannot be fulfilled for them or for the passengers. So we all have to actively participate in God's promises in order for it to come to fulfillment. This assurance of physical salvation through the belief in the divine message to Paul and their commitment to remain with him is a parable of this essential spiritual salvation, which is part of Paul's message. Believing in the gospel message and solidarity with the gospel messenger. Impulsively or wisely, the soldiers cut the ropes for the dinghy and it falls away. The passengers and crew's fate will now be the same. Nobody gets to escape. 33 through 38, each successive appearance of Paul in this voyage narrative moves him more to the center of the story. As the key to the physical survival of everyone on board, he encourages those who, because of constant suspense in verse 33, have not gone to the galley to prepare a meal for 2 weeks. He urges them to gather strength for the final push to shore by what else? Having a meal. So in the midst of all of this, where they haven't eaten in who knows how long, a very long time, Paul says, okay, we're still getting beat up by the waves. We know we're probably going to crash on shore. So what do? Let's have something to eat. Again, Paul uses a kind of a salvation terminology. You need it to survive. Literally, this is your salvation. This is part of your salvation. We need to have some sustenance to face what is yet to come. So his reassurance comes in the form of a proverbial saying in the Old Testament and Jesus' teaching, not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. So certain is this physical rescue under the divine providence of Yahweh God that not even a hair, the most easily detached part of the human body, will be lost in the process. Paul matches words with actions. He took some bread and gave thanks to God. Then he broke it and began to eat. We should here read that Luke wants us to understand. Paul eats here with a Eucharistic or a Holy Communion intent. The Eucharist is behind what Paul has in mind. We need sustenance to strengthen us to meet the days ahead. Originally, the words of institution probably bracketed everyday meals of believers, so the sanctifying giving of thanks, the inaugural breaking of the bread, took on a fancy theological word, charismatic, which just basically means proclamation or preaching. So the breaking of the bread takes on a preaching significance in combination with Jesus' words, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Now we only use that at the holy meal that we gather for around the altar, at least here around an altar rail, and we hear those words. At that time with Paul, it was probably shared at every meal. This charismatic preaching or proclamation significance of eating a meal together, the breaking of the bread. Paul could have done this here, although to what effect? This is the climax of this being acted out in a parable in which physical salvation by divine providence, facilitated by the wisdom and guidance of God's apostle Paul, points to a spiritual salvation of which this apostle is also the messenger. So to those who just don't get it, Paul's simply being prudent, eating food in thankfulness and confidence. To those who hear the Lord's death proclaimed until he comes again, Paul's Eucharistic or Holy Communion example leads to the open secret of the apostles' life, faith in Christ's saving word and work, physical and spiritual. So we're told now that the ship's company, they all are encouraged. They are taking courage from Paul and what Paul is explaining to them, and the meal that Paul shares with them. So they turn away from their anxious, despairing vigil, regain sufficient heart to take food. Indeed, we're talking about 276 people probably on board this ship, and they eat their fill, according to Luke. And then they set about final preparations for approaching the shore. They know they're going to crash. They know the ship is going to be busted apart. They hope not, certainly, but that hope is fleeting. So their precious cargo of grain, which was the prime reason they were traveling at this time of year, that has served as a ballast for the storm. Now that's going to prevent them from running aground as high as possible on the shore. So they begin to toss the grain over. The whole purpose for sailing. The effect of Paul's encouragement and a Eucharistic or Holy Communion example demonstrates the power of one who has determined to be salt and light, as well as witness to those around them. There's an old saying about man does not live by bread alone. You've heard Jesus say that as well. And here they're literally throwing the bread away. They're throwing away the grain so that they've feasted now on the bread that they have. They're preparing for the future. They have sustenance to meet the future. So at daybreak, starting at 39, the crew plans based on their observations. They see the shore now. They try to recognize the land. I'm not sure they do. All they can make out really is this bay, and if you live in this area, you know what Tampa Bay is. And it has ahead of them, there's a sandy beach. They hope that they can beach the ship, as it were. This is their plan. If they might be able to pull it off, the optive mood here of personal wishes shows a kind of a level of uncertainty with which they continue to labor. Yeah, we hope we can do this. Maybe, probably not. Who cares? Who knows? So they cut loose the anchors, or simply let the ropes fall into the sea. They untie the ropes that held the rudders to keep them from drifting. These two large paddles secured during the storm are now lowered into each side of the ship at the stern to provide steerage as they head into the beach. They hoist the foresail to the wind. The sail sloped forward and provided some steerage and some kind of navigation toward where they want to be. And then the ship, the crew and the ship begin to head toward the beach. At the entrance to the bay, they unexpectedly strike a sandbar. It can happen. It probably stood in only about 13 feet of water, so the ship effectively ran aground, for the bow stuck as fast and it would not move. The combination of the bay's floor composition and the direction of the wind made this sandbar the ship's final resting place until it breaks apart. Yet the sea was not through with the ship. The pounding of the surf gradually broke up the stern. Continuously imperfect means it just kept on beating and breaking up little bits at a time. Paul's prophecy is coming true. Only the ship will be destroyed. Verse 22. The soldiers knew that they could pay with their lives for any prisoners who escaped when all abandoned the ship for land. So their plan was kill the prisoners. The centurion had other plans to spare Paul, so he stopped the plan to kill all the prisoners and ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. In a very real sense, Paul became a saving presence. For saving Paul automatically meant saving the other prisoners. As a mediator of physical preservation, Paul again becomes a living parable of spiritual salvation, which is just as certain when individuals take refuge in the name of Christ, the Christ whom Paul preaches. So when swimming, whether floating on planks, which may have been used to hold the grain cargo in place, riding on the backs of swimmers, however they got there, everyone was able to reach the land safely. Paul's comforting presence, Paul's encouragement, Paul's prophetic words have been fulfilled to the last detail. The strongest of natural forces threatened Paul's existence, and even that had been unable to stop God's providential purposes for Paul. Solidarity with Paul meant physical life for the crew. For those considering the claims of Christ, like Theophilus and his friends who are reading Luke's Acts of the Apostles, the question then is, if God's messengers, wow, I need a drink or something. If God's messenger can get through to old salts of the sea, these sailors who were quite hardened enough to sail at this time of year, what can his message do for me? What can his message do for us? What will his message mean for those who are still seeking some knowledge or a relationship with Jesus Christ? As I leave you those questions for today, we have completed chapter 27. We're going to begin chapter 28 next time, which is the final chapter. We're almost there, folks. Hold on. Hang in there with me. We can get through this together. Thank you for joining me again this week. I encourage you or invite you to leave your questions, leave your comments in the videos below the video in the comment section. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and like this video. If you're in the Sun City Center area this Sunday, join us for worship at 10 a.m. If you can't join us in person, you can join us on our live stream on this same YouTube channel Sunday at 10 a.m. Thank you again for joining me this week. Take care. God bless.